I want to share the moment I stopped believing in the timeline. It wasn't dramatic. Not a single photo or shocking document. It was quieter. A Tuesday afternoon, looking at an architectural survey of a mid-18th century European building, what official records call a customs depot. And I noticed, the ceiling clearance was 40 feet. 40 feet in a customs depot supposedly built for horse-drawn carts and men with ledgers. I sat with that. Then I looked at the nearby structures in the same survey. Long parallel berths. Covered walkways. Massive mooring points along the exterior walls, drawn as hitching posts. Hitching posts for horses. Except they weren't at ground level. They were 3 stories up, at roof height, facing open sky. I closed that survey. Opened another. Then another. The more I looked, the more customs depot felt like a translation, deliberate, careful. And that's where this begins. Not with planes. Not with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903. Not with the certificates, clippings, or grainy footage we've all seen since childhood. No. This starts much earlier, with structures that shouldn't exist. Infrastructure too deliberate, too coordinated, too expensive for the purposes we've been told. This is about airports that existed before airports were supposed to exist. Stay with me. Let me ask something obvious. What is an airport? Strip away jet bridges, duty-free shops, departure boards. Strip everything modern. What's left? At its core, an airport is a set of very specific features. A large, flat, open approach, unobstructed, carefully graded. Structures that can shelter enormous vehicles from weather. Mast or anchor points for mooring. Fuel and supply infrastructure. Passenger processing, arrival, departure, waiting, transfer. Administrative oversight. And coordination, communication with other nodes in a network. That's an airport. That's what the function demands. Now hold that definition, purely functional, technology agnostic. Then look at a completely different category of structures. Ones we've been taught to see as something else: warehouses, agricultural stations, military depots, exhibition grounds, rail marshalling yards. Because here's what I found, again and again, across multiple continents and decades of the 18th and 19th centuries, complexes of architecture that fit the functional profile of an aerial transit hub almost perfectly. Not partially. Not vaguely. Precisely. With a precision that becomes impossible to dismiss once you start tabulating. Let me describe what a mid-18th century transit hub looks like according to the official historical record. It doesn't exist. That's the answer. Coaching inns, port docks, river landings, modest, functional, scaled to human bodies and animal labor. That's 1750 per the textbooks. Now let me describe what I actually found. In Western Europe, dozens of large-scale enclosed structures from the early to mid-1700s share a peculiar set of architectural features. Features with no satisfying explanation under the official timeline. Long unobstructed interior spans of 50 to 100 feet. Vaulted ceilings. External anchor points at elevation. Wide, flat approach corridors, sometimes paved, sometimes cleared of natural obstructions for extraordinary distances. Drainage systems of enormous sophistication, channeling water away from what can only be called loading surfaces. Loading surfaces, not warehouses. The proportions are wrong for warehouses. In a warehouse, you optimize for stackable vertical storage, walls close together, shelving, vertical height. What these structures optimize for is horizontal clearance, ceiling height, lateral access. That's not a warehouse. That's a hangar. And here's the strangest part, many appear in regional maps and surveys under remarkably vague designations. Grand Depot. Civic Pavilion. Municipal Hall of Commerce. Descriptions so generic they communicate almost nothing, for a period otherwise extraordinarily specific in its record-keeping, property records, tax assessments, precise land surveys. These particular structures are documented in the haziest terms. The official explanation collapses here. It simply does. You cannot account for the dimensions, layout, and absence of detailed records with Civic Pavilion. That explanation breaks the moment you stand in front of one of these buildings and count the anchor rings. I need to talk about the photographs. I know what you're thinking, the 1700s predate photography. Daguerreotypes don't appear until the 1830s. Practical photographic technology as we understand it arrives in the mid-19th century. True. That's the official record, and I'm not disputing the chemistry. But there's a category of early photographic images, daguerreotypes, calotypes, albumen prints from the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, that show something the photographers apparently didn't think worth remarking on. Something so ordinary to them they simply included it in the frame. In the background, on the horizon, half obscured by architectural detail, large, elongated aerial forms. Not birds. Not clouds. Elongated, cigar-shaped or rounded structures, sometimes with what appear to be gondola attachments beneath, sometimes moored, sometimes, in the most arresting examples, appearing to approach or depart from exactly the kind of large clearance structures we've been discussing. The official history of lighter-than-air travel has a clean narrative. Hydrogen balloon flight, Montgolfier Brothers, 1783. Steerable airships, dirigibles not until the 1850s at the earliest, practically not until the 1880s and 1890s. Zeppelin technology, early 20th century. A clean, progressive development. But this raises a simple, critical question. Why do photographs from the 1840s, decades before steerable airships supposedly existed, occasionally show what appear to be moored dirigibles against urban skylines? And why, when these images are raised, does the response from academia and archives tend to be not investigation but dismissal? Photographic artifacts. Cloud formations. Processing errors. Not elongated, cigar-shaped structures with visible gondolas. Not objects moored at rooftop height. Not things hovering in fixed positions relative to large civic structures. No. Cloud formations. The silence was deafening. Here's where the mystery deepens in a way I can hardly rationalize away. The architectural features I've described, long approach corridors, elevated anchor points, vast interior clearances, suspiciously vague documentation, are not confined to Western Europe. They repeat across continents, across cultures, across what we're told were completely unconnected civilizations, with unsettling precision. In North America, structures from the mid to late colonial period, predating the Revolutionary War, sharing these proportions. Grand civic buildings in early American cities with ceiling clearances far exceeding any functional need described in the historical record. Some were later repurposed, converted to train stations when the railroad era arrived, then converted again, in some cases, to aviation terminals in the early 20th century. 3 separate transit modalities, 3 separate first uses, all in the same building. Why does a building designed in 1740 happen to be perfectly suited for a technology supposedly not invented for another 160 years? And then, when that technology is superseded, suited for the technology after that? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In South America, colonial-era administrative complexes with the same vaulted approach halls, the same overbuilt flooring capable of bearing loads far in excess of any warehouse or government building requirement. The same anchor points. The same mysterious drainage. In regions where the Spanish colonial record is otherwise extraordinarily detailed about every nail, every beam, every shipment of tile, these specific structures appear as administrative complex, and nothing more. In parts of Central Asia and the Russian steppe, structures associated with what some researchers have tentatively called remnants of a prior administrative civilization, and here the word Tartaria enters the conversation, not as a defined empire or mapped nation-state, but as a descriptor for something that existed before the current historical consensus, something systematically reduced to cartographic margin notes and dismissive footnotes. These structures share the same vocabulary, long horizontal spans, elevated mooring infrastructure, wide approach clearances, remarkable unnecessary precision. And here's the strangest part, the dates don't cooperate. Some of these structures are dated to periods when, according to the official record, the regions they occupy were either uninhabited, pre-industrial, or incapable of the engineering they represent. The dating itself is in many cases contested, not openly in journals or symposia, but quietly in marginal notes of regional surveys, in footnotes of architectural histories most people never read. The evidence suggests something much larger than regional anomaly. Something coordinated. Something worldwide. And coordination in 1720 or 1740 or 1760 was supposedly impossible. The communications technology didn't exist. The engineering knowledge wasn't shared. The civilizations in question were, per the textbook, isolated from one another. So how do you build the same building on 4 continents? How? I want to be precise, because precision matters. I'm not describing a known empire. I'm not placing borders on a map. The word Tartaria appears in European cartography from the medieval period through the 18th century as a designation for vast, imperfectly understood territories, Central and Eastern Asia, stretching in some maps to include everything east of Moscow and north of China. It functions in those maps as an admission of ignorance. Here is a place we don't fully understand. But ignorance is not the same as emptiness. What interests me is not Tartaria as a political entity. It's the possibility, and I'm asking this as a question, not a claim, that those territories designated as Tartaria on 17th and 18th century European maps contain remnants of a sophisticated civilization. One that had developed or inherited aerial transit technology. One that built infrastructure to support it. And one that, for reasons we can't fully reconstruct, ceased to exist in recognizable form before the modern historical record solidified, before the records we now treat as primary sources were written. That's where the architecture becomes impossible to ignore. Because when European explorers and administrators moved through Central Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the great surveying expeditions pushed into territories labeled Tartaria, they found things. Large ruined structures. Buildings of unusual precision. Foundations that seem to predate the civilizations currently occupying the land. In the official records of those expeditions, those findings are documented and then set aside, classified as ruins of unknown origin, attributed to various ancient peoples in ways that satisfy no one who looks closely at the engineering. Unknown origin. That phrase does a lot of work in a lot of documents. The deeper I went into expedition records from Central Asia, the Russian interior, the territories on those old maps as Tartaria, the more that phrase appeared. Unknown origin. Unknown function. Unknown date. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern of deliberate vagueness. The consistent refusal to integrate anomalous evidence into the official narrative. The repeated application of vague language to specific things. Here's what keeps me returning to this question. The technology vanishes, not slowly, not gradually. It doesn't fade the way technologies typically fade, leaving traces, transitional forms, the archaeology of replacement. It vanishes with a completeness that is itself anomalous. If airship or dirigible-based transit infrastructure existed in the early 18th century, and I'm saying if, and I'm asking you to hold that if with me, what would we expect to find in the historical record? Transitional documents. Engineering notes. The accumulated iterative knowledge every technology leaves behind. Regional variations, the same basic concept adapted for different climates, materials, cultural contexts. Failures, accidents, legal records of liability and loss. Insurance documents. The bureaucratic residue of a technology in active use. What we find instead is silence. And when that silence ends in the mid-19th century, what emerges is described as entirely new: the balloon, the airship, the dirigible, all presented as inventions, as the origination of concepts that had never previously existed. But what if they weren't inventions? What if they were recoveries? What if the engineers and scientists of the 19th century who invented lighter-than-air flight were not originating ideas but rediscovering them? Working from fragments, from architectural evidence, from the kind of structures I've been describing, those overbuilt, vaguely documented, strangely proportioned buildings still standing in European and American cities, still waiting, still bearing their anchor rings and impossible ceiling clearances. This raises a simple but critical question. How do you reinvent something that never fully disappeared from the landscape? How do you originate a concept when the infrastructure for that concept is still physically present in the cities you inhabit? The official explanation collapses here. It simply does. I want to talk about what happens to these structures over time. The pattern, once you see it, is consistent enough to constitute its own argument. Stage 1, the structure exists. Large, precise, overbuilt for any stated purpose. Appears in surveys and maps under generic designations. Functions in some capacity the official record does not clearly specify. Stage 2, a new transit technology arrives, rail, then early automotive, then aviation, and the structure is repurposed. Not demolished. Not rebuilt. Repurposed. Minor alterations, different signage, new function, old bones. The original architecture, those long clearances, anchor points, approach corridors, remains largely intact because it happens to be perfectly suited for the new use as well. Stage 3, the history of the structure is rewritten backward. The repurposed building is described as having been built for its new function, or its original function is described in terms compatible with current technology. Obviously, this was a precursor to the train station it eventually became. The wide corridors were designed for the volume of civic commerce. The original anomaly is absorbed into a new narrative. Stage 4, the original documentation, whatever specific records might have described the structure's true first function, is either lost, classified, or never consulted again. The archive closes around the comfortable explanation like water around a stone. This is not conspiracy in the traditional sense. I'm not describing a room full of people deciding to lie. I'm describing something quieter and more pervasive, the tendency of institutions to prefer coherent narratives over anomalous evidence, the tendency of official history to sand down the edges of things that don't fit. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across continents, across centuries, in document collections from institutions that have never spoken to one another. The same vagueness. The same overbuilding. The same convenient subsequent repurposing. The same closing of archives. Not coordination, exactly, but something that produces the same result as coordination. And that is perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all. Let me return to the photographs. There's a category of early photographic image, and I've spent considerable time in digitized archives tracing these, where the anomalous aerial form appears in images associated with known large clearance structures. Images taken from vantage points suggesting the photographer was documenting the building, not the sky. And yet there, in the sky, above the roofline, against the distant horizon, is the form. Elongated. Deliberate. Too consistent in shape across different images, different photographers, different cities and decades, to be a processing artifact. There are images from the 1850s and 1860s, the very early days of urban photography in Europe and North America, where these forms appear above structures that were, within decades, formally redesignated as transit hubs when rail technology arrived. The same buildings. The same skylines. The aerial form present in the earlier image, absent in later ones as the 20th century approached and the technology of images became more reliable, the archives more carefully curated. Why would an image processing artifact appear consistently above a specific category of building? Why would cloud formations cluster over structures with anchor rings at rooftop height? Why would the anomalies, whatever they are, appear in early photographs and then systematically disappear from the record as photographic technology improved and archival practices became more rigorous? The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidence. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm showing you what I found. I'm asking the questions I found impossible to stop asking once I started. Here's the question I keep returning to. If any part of this is true, if those structures were built for aerial transit, if the technology existed earlier than we're told, if the photographs capture something real, then who built it? I want to sit with that question rather than answer it. Because the moment you answer it, the moment you name a civilization or a group or a power, you move from mystery into mythology. And I'm not interested in mythology. I'm interested in evidence. What I can say is this. The structures exist. Physically present, many still standing, still bearing their anomalous features, still documented in surveys you can access if you know where to look. The early photographs exist. The vague designations in the official record exist. The pattern of repurposing exists. Something built those structures. Something used them. Something, and this is the word I keep coming back to, something was lost. Not misplaced. Not forgotten in the way small things are forgotten. Lost in the way that requires active losing. The kind of loss that leaves behind only the physical evidence, stripped of its context, relabeled, absorbed into a different story. The kind of loss that looks from a distance like it might have been intentional. I started this investigation with a ceiling height, 40 feet in a customs depot. I end it with a simpler question. What was in the sky? Not what we're told was in the sky. Not the official inventory of 18th century aerial objects, which is, by definition, almost empty. But what was actually there? What were those anchor rings waiting for? What were those approach corridors leading to? What did the people who built those structures, who commissioned them, funded them, maintained them, operated them, what did they see when they looked up? Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The long clearances. The anchor points. The vague documentation. The photographs with their inexplicable backgrounds. The structures that keep getting repurposed perfectly for every new transit technology that arrives. The archives that close. The records that thin. The word unknown appearing again and again in documents from expedition to expedition, continent to continent, century to century. Unknown origin. Unknown function. Unknown date. The silence was deafening. And the sky was full of something. The deeper you go, the more the official explanation breaks down. Not here, not there, but everywhere. All at once, across 4 continents and 3 centuries of vague documentation and overbuilt architecture and photographs that don't belong to their own era. This raises a simple but critical question. What do we actually know about the sky above 1740? Above 1720? Above 1690? And perhaps more importantly, what have we agreed, collectively and quietly, not to ask? The buildings are still there. The anchor rings are still there. The sky is still open. And somewhere between what we've been told and what the evidence shows, there is a gap large enough to fit an entire lost world of transit. An entire civilization of departure and arrival. Of mooring and casting off. Of whatever it was that rose into that pre-modern sky and crossed the distances we were told couldn't be crossed until someone built an airport to receive it.